Welcome back, and now it's time for the last session of day 3, and in some ways we've really kept the best for last. Our next speaker, Dr. Valter Longo, is a specialist doing research in the field of longevity and healthy eating. His book, The Longevity Diet, is a bestseller, and Time magazine called him one of the 50 most influential people in healthcare. So, intermittent fasting or not, let's listen to him talking to Sanchita Sharma.
Thank you, Sunetra. So I'm going to start the session by, you can fast in many ways. One, of course, is not eating at all. But then there's several other ways of fasting. You can exclude certain foods and food groups from your diet. You can eat within a limited time period, or you can eat on some days and not eat on others. But now we have a nutrition program that mimics fasting and tricks your body into thinking you're fasting when you're eating certain foods. So this is fabulous because it brings the benefits of fasting while helping you avoid hunger pangs, fatigue, and headaches that are associated with fasting. So I'm going to invite Professor Longo to tell us more about that, to also guide us on how we can adopt this program in our daily lives. And he's going to have a short presentation over the next 20 to 25 minutes, which will be followed by questions and answers. Over to you, Professor Longo.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. And so next slide. Yeah. And so I'm going to talk about fasting. And I want to start here with this slide that you see on COVID, just to point out that aging and the health status of a person is so important for so many different diseases, including COVID. So you see those bars that are progressively higher, and they're the age risk of mortality, the age dependent or the age associated risk of mortality from COVID. You see that the last bar where it says 14 point something, that's for people that are over 80 years of age. So, there's a 100-fold difference in the risk of dying of COVID based on whether you are, 20 years old or over 80 years old. But then if you look below, you see that there's also this very big difference based on whether you have age-related diseases going from cardiovascular, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, hypertension, cancer. So patients, subjects that were already suffering from age-related conditions, now they're also at a much higher risk for death from COVID. Next slide. Yeah. So what do we do about aging, and how do we regulate the aging process so that we can benefit in many different ways? And so I like to show some of the stories from centenarians. This is a lady in the city that I live in now in Los Angeles, and she got to 115 years of age, and she was very careful with everything she did. And so she said that the formula for making it to such an old age was never drinking or fooling around. So that was Gertrude Baines in Los Angeles. But next slide. But this was very different from in France, Madame Calmont. And Madame Calmont did not pay attention to their lifestyle. She smoked until 117 and ate lots of sweets. So what are the how do we intervene on aging? And I think we can argue based on maybe 100 years of research, and nutrition is by far right now. I mean, eventually things may change, and pharmacologically we might be able to intervene in the aging process. But right now, nutrition is probably the most powerful way to alter how fast we age, and also alter whether we're going to get age-related diseases, diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases, etc. Next slide. And so I started working on, in the early 90s, 30 years ago actually. I started working on the genes that control aging, but eventually I realized that the technology, and so we were successful in identifying lots of the genes that control the aging process in simple organisms all the way to humans. But then I realized that the technology and what we call biohacking, so figuring out how to interfere with the normal processes, this is very important. But tradition and where we come from is as important. So how do you combine these two things? And I thought, after so many years, maybe about 20 years ago, we started thinking about. So I was seeing that simple organisms that were starved, bacteria were becoming longer lived, and yeast were becoming longer lived than mice. And so I started thinking there's something very powerful about not just reducing the calories, about small, short periods of fasting, and so I started looking at the literature, realized that lots of animals, so for example, here the emperor penguins, they have periods in where they become large, they gain weight, they even become obese, and then they have long periods that can last for months in where they don't eat at all, right? So then this allowed me to understand that some of these things that we see as diseases, like diabetes, are really part of the history of all organisms. So that you accumulate as much fat as possible so that you can survive. And so there's actually survival mechanism. Now, of course, the problem is now we accumulate lots of fat, but we never use it because the winter time never comes. So we have the abundance time, but not the times where food is limited or absent. Next slide. So just to show you the one slide about how fasting revolutionizes metabolism, right? So I always challenge people and say, try to find something that has more effects on more cells and on more genes than fasting. And I've been asking these questions to lots of people all over the world for 20 years. I could never even get somebody to challenge me theoretically. Say, well, I think this cocktail of drugs would be causing more changes than fasting. So it never happened. So for example, as I just mentioned, during fasting now, these fats, the adipocytes are the fat cells. So fats are released from fat cells, and they go to the liver. And the liver, there's a generation of ketone bodies, and these ketone bodies now go all over the body. And from the word ketogenesis, right? So the body is now having to survive not from food that comes from the outside, but food that comes from the inside, and particularly food that comes from the abdominal fat, So this is where our reservoir, our energy reservoir is. Next slide. Yeah, so for a long time, so people have this illusion that, we use words like fasting. And I always say fasting and people ask me, journalists ask me, is fasting good for you? And I say, fasting, it doesn't mean anything. It's just like eating. What is eating good for you? Yeah, some type of eating is good for you. Some amount of eating is good for you, but some of it is very bad for you. And that's the same is true for fasting, right? So for example, people don't realize that, there are a lot of side effects, for example, for water-only fasting. And at some point, if you fast for too long, your metabolism slows down. And so a good thing becomes actually a bad thing that can last for a long, long time, right? So it's not really about fasting or eating. It's about how you eat and how you fast. And so we've been spending decades on this. And eventually, we started maybe 15 years ago, we started a clinical trial on water-only fasting in cancer patients because we were showing that the fasting was protecting normal cells and was killing the cancer cells. But we realized that nobody wanted to do water-only fasting. And also there were lots of side effects potentially associated with water-only fasting. So everybody was worried about, sending the patients back home, patient receiving chemotherapy, having to do water-only fasting. So we developed, thanks to the U.S. government, a fasting mimicking diet. And so the fasting mimicking diet is a low-calorie, it's a plant-based. So everything comes from plants. Low-calorie, low sugar, low protein, high unsaturated fats, right? So the high levels of olive oil, nuts, and high-fat components that are vegan-based. Next slide. Recently, just a few months ago, we published something that we have been meaning to publish for a long, long time, and which is lots of people, and I'll talk in a second about the ideal everyday diet, right? But lots of people say, I'm not going to change anything. In fact, most people are not willing to change their diet very much. And so I always thought, what if we could say, try to have a good diet, but if you can't, at least do periodically a fasting mimicking diet, right? This fasting mimicking diet that I just told you about, which lasts 5 days, right? So we did exactly this. We used the human version, in fact, with mice. And so we took mice, we gave them lots of calories, lots of fat, so the mice became very big with this diet. But at the same time, we used the same diet on mice that had another group of mice, and that once a month they did a 5-day fasting mimicking diet, and the results were really remarkable. And I have to say that the first author of this paper we just published is an Indian student, a postdoc researcher that works in my lab in Los Angeles, Amrenda Mishra. And so remarkably, the next slide, you see, for example, cholesterol with age. If you look at those purple bars, right, those where it says HFCD, that's a high fat and calorie diet, right? So, and if you look at HFCD on the far right, there are these obese, very large mice, right? So the mice become very large on this high fat and calorie diet. But look at what happens to the mice in the middle. We have the same all the time, high fat and calorie diet, beside for 5 days a month, right? So 5 days a month now of this fasting mimicking diet are sufficient to prevent this obesity phenotype. But also, if you look at the left and look at the consequences of just 5 days a month, middle age and all mice develop this high cholesterol in the middle and in the right, where it says 23 cycles. But if you look at where it says a high fat calorie diet and FMD, the cholesterol level are back to normal. So the fasting mimicking diet is able to return the cholesterol level, not just the obesity, but also the cholesterol level to normal, to those of the mice that are on a regular diet, where it says control. Those are mice that eat a normal diet and maintain a normal weight. Next slide. If you look at, next slide, if you look at lean body mass, you see there, this is a muscle mass. And see, most dietary intervention will affect negatively the muscle mass. But you see that the mice, it doesn't matter what diet they control, the high-fat diet or the high-fat diet plus the fasting mimicking diet, and the lean body mass, the muscle mass, is not affected. And in fact, we have shown in the past that a lifelong use of the FMD actually increase bone density even in mice on the normal diet compared to mice on the normal diet, right? So there is a big effect on fat that you see there. In the center is the high-fat diet, and the green is the high-fat diet plus the fasting mimicking diet, but there is no effect on the lean body mass. And if you look at on the right serum ketones, you see that in the last one on the right, where it says high-fat calorie diet plus FMD, you see that the ketone bodies are higher. Remember, the ketone bodies are evidence of the breakdown of fat, and this is done 4 days after the mice return to this normal high-calorie, high-fat diet. So even after they return to this high-calorie, high-fat diet, they're still burning fat, right? And that's exactly what we want. We want these short periods of fasting mimicking diet to reprogram the system so it keeps burning fat instead of accumulating fat. Next slide. So this is the longevity, right? So again, the mice on the right are on a high-fat diet. The one in the center are on a high-fat diet plus the 5 days a month of the fasting mimicking diet, and the one on the left are on a controlled diet. And you see that the purple curve, the high-fat diet tremendously shortens the lifespan and the health span of the mice, and just as 5 days a month of the fasting mimicking diet is able to restore that and bring the lifespan very close to the one of mice that are on a good diet. Next slide. Yeah, so what about people? So a long time ago, we developed, as I mentioned, a version for cancer patients, and then eventually we developed a version for normal people, and we tested this clinically. So I started a company called ElNutra, and I don't take any consulting from the company, and I donate 100%. I will donate 100% of my shares to charity. But I thought it was very important to have this clinically tested and to make sure that we have something that is starting to look like medicine for people, rather than have people improvise. So again, this is it's plant-based, high fat, low calorie, low sugar, low protein diets the last 5 days, and we tested this in people of all kinds of nationalities here in Los Angeles. And there's 100 participants, but I have to say now we confirm these results with multiple additional clinical trials which are not yet published. So people for 5 days a month, they went on this diet, and then like for the mice that I just showed you, they went on whatever diet they had for the rest of the time. Some of them were obese, some of them were overweight, some of them were normal weight. Next slide. And you see here, as I mentioned, as I showed for the mice, the body weight decreases, the abdominal fat decreases. The left is the control group, and on the right is the loss of body weight, abdominal fat, waist circumference in the FMD group. And you see there's major losses in body weight, but it's all abdominal fat and fat coming from the belly. But the lean body mass, the relative lean body mass is not affected. So the muscle mass is not affected, but the relative lean body mass. So they're now losing fat, but maintaining normal muscle mass. And this is why you see go up actually and not down. So this is really a very interesting and very rare, by the way, combination, right? Most diets will make everything go down, including the muscle. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so then we see differential effects, right? So with most diets, everything is driven down. But with this 5 days a month of the fasting mimicking diet, so for example, those that have normal glucose levels, those that are not pre-diabetic nor diabetic, we don't see much of an effect of these 3 cycles. But if those that are pre-diabetic, they have high glucose level, blood glucose level, now we see a drop, and most of them return to the normal glucose level. Next slide. The same is true for IGF-1. This is a growth factor that is involved is a marker, a potential risk factor for cancer. Again, those that start at normal levels, they have a big decline, but those at risk for cancer, after 3 cycles of the fasting mimicking diet, they have a major drop in IGF-1. Next slide. C-reactive protein is a marker for inflammation, systemic inflammation. So the body is in an inflammatory state. And again, those that start with no inflammation, no changes, but those that start with moderate to high levels of CRP, they have a drop in C-reactive protein. Next slide. And the same is true for hypertension, which I am not showing, and also cholesterol here. Those that start with cholesterol above 200, they have a bigger drop in cholesterol level. So you see, it's not hitting one risk factor for disease, but this fasting mimicking diet and these fasting refeeding cycles are going after the function, right? So most people that are 20 years old, they don't have high cholesterol, they don't have inflammation, they don't have hypertension, they don't have risk factor for cancer. So these cycles are bringing the biological age back. Probably now we're working on a study, attempting to show that. So we'll find out soon, But every indication is for this dietary pattern to make people younger in some ways. Next slide. Okay, so what about instead the diet that should be used every day? So we've been focusing, I call it a 5-pillar system. I don't want to go through all the 5 pillars, but I say if you look at multiple disciplines in science and put it all together, epidemiological studies, study of centenaria, clinical studies, basic research, study of complex system, I came up with this, and really reflective of hundreds and hundreds of studies. So the longevity diet. So other than what I just told you, this FMD periodically, maybe 3 times a year, the mostly plant-based diet, but you can be vegan and you can be very healthy, but it's not easy to be vegan and healthy. And so, for most people, I recommend, it's possible. So, but for most people, I think eating fish a few times a week is recommendable. And low protein intake, but sufficient, low but sufficient. So there should be about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So if you weigh 50 kilograms, it's about 40 grams of protein. If you weigh 80 kilograms, about 65 grams of proteins. So, and the diet should be high complex carbohydrate and healthy fats. So the olive oil, the nuts, and then lots of vegetable, lots of legumes, high nourishment, omega-3, vitamins, minerals. This is very important that the body has all the nutrients it needs. And then 12 hours a day. So keep the food intake for 12 hours a day. Don't go much longer or much shorter. So stay right about, so 8 a.m., 8 p.m., 7 a.m., 7 p.m. So eat within those 12 hours and not outside of the 12 hours. And then I say for people that are, and that we're starting a large clinical trial of 500 people now in southern Italy. And so for people that are overweight, obese, or tend to get there, have breakfast. Skipping breakfast is not recommendable. Always have breakfast plus either lunch or dinner, and then substitute either the lunch or dinner with a small, let's say less than 100 calorie snack. It could be fruit, it could be some nuts, it could be a small salad or something like that. Next slide. Yeah, so now I started 2 foundations, one in Los Angeles, the Create Cures Foundation, and one in Milan, Italy. And so at the foundation, we've been carrying out this, we follow lots of people, and this is, so we've done a study with 140 patients, which we haven't published yet, but I'll just show you some data from that. And so they did either the fasting mimicking diet, once every few months, or they did the longevity diet, that I just showed you, or they did both, right? So ideally, we wanted to do both, and this is where 140 patients, 40 obese, 40 overweight, 60 normal weight, next slide. And you see that this is just the results on body weight. So in just 5 months, you see that we have about 4.5 kilograms of weight lost in the obese group, about 2 kilograms, 2.5 kilograms in the overweight, and also the normal weight, there's a little bit of loss. So now we're looking at lots of different risk factors for diseases, and so soon enough we'll be publishing on that. But I just think that the nutrition is so important that if you can find somebody to follow you in India and work with you on this longevity and fasting mimicking diet, I think it's very important. Next slide. Yeah, so next slide. Yeah, so disease risk goes up with diet, aging, genes, and either the longevity diet, the fasting mimicking diet, or both are bringing back the disease risk, probably because they're bringing back just the functional state of the person and the biological age of the person. And so, by being younger and more functional, but also by having less fat and inflammation, et cetera, the system is gonna function better, but also live longer. And the next slide is just thanks to the lots of people that. Next slide. Yeah. Thanks to lots of people that have contributed to this work. These are just some of the people, but thank you. And this includes lots of students and researchers from India also. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Longo. So I want to start by asking you, would you recommend FMD every month? Because your book talks about that people should do it every 6 months? And also, can both men and women do it? Follow the diet?
Yeah, so both men and women can do it, and every month now we're testing that for diabetes patients. We have a study in Holland, which is finished, and soon enough we'll publish on that. Yeah, so if somebody has diabetes, then they can talk to their doctor and consider the fasting mimicking diet once a month. But for most people, I think about 2 to 3 times a year. Of course, if somebody's overweight and obese, it might be 3 to 4 times a year. So it's just probably best to work with a professional, either a doctor or a nutritionist. But this has to be adjusted based on the risk factors and also on the initial problems of that person, particularly abdominal circumference and abdominal weight.
No, but if it's a healthy person, can a healthy person do it every month? Just to maintain weight and,
a healthy person should not do it once a month. The idea of the fasting mimicking diet is you do it when you need to do it. It's not about doing as much as possible. I mean, eventually it may be that we'll find out that this is so powerful that people should do it once a month. But right now, we rather say, do it about 3 times a year. And but if it's not enough, then you might have to do it once a month, because of weight and, again, being obese or being overweight and just eating too much, right? Remember the mice, right? That I just showed. They had a terrible diet, very high fat, very high calorie, and so once a month was necessary. And they returned to, for almost everything we looked at, to normal. But yeah, if you don't have a bad diet to start with, and if you don't have a bad weight and lots of problems, there is no need to do it once a month.
So there's no evidence that shows that it'll benefit healthy people if they do it every month.
In the clinical trials, we've done it once a month, but we don't think that that's recommendable right now unless you have diabetes and your doctor agrees that you should do it once a month.
You mentioned biohacking. So do the benefits happen because you're shocking your body into another state? Because how exactly does cell regeneration take place?
No, it's got nothing to do with shocking. Some of my colleagues talk about these things. It's got nothing to do with shocking. It's got to do with the all organism, right? Even a bacteria, or a yeast, even unicellular organism. When you're starving, you become larger and larger. You accumulate lots of food, essentially lots of carbon sources. And then during fasting, you start using it, and you shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink, and eventually you can become very small, right? So so I always use a picture of my old mentor who did a long 2 years of calorie restriction and became very thin. And so you become very thin, and then at a certain point you re-expand, right? And this going thin because of fasting and then re-expanding is just an incredible process that starts the same, and this we've seen in mice very clearly, the same programs that you use when you're first born, right? What does it mean? That the organs start regenerating during the refeeding, right? And they're using the same rebuilding programs that are first used during embryogenesis, when we are first born.
You also mentioned that people should select ingredients that our ancestors would have eaten. So does ethnicity and race play a role in how it affects our body?
Yeah, absolutely. So eventually we're going to have many thousands and thousands of diets for thousands and thousands of different people. So, somebody, just to think about celiac disease, right? So all of a sudden, if you're in the family, you have celiac disease and you have genetic predisposition, you may be not able to eat any bread and any food that has gluten in it. And and same thing for lactose intolerant, right? So if you're Norwegian, you're going to be lactose tolerant. So milk is not a problem for you. But if you're Japanese or Southern Italian, most likely you're going to be lactose intolerant, and so eating even a little bit of milk is gonna hurt you. and it might take you years to figure it out, right? So yeah, so I think it's very important to think about what was it that your grandparents and your parents were eating all the time, and what was it that they were eating and they never bothered them, right? So most likely, I mean, this is not about picking what your grandparents ate, because they could have had a terrible diet. This is about looking at the longevity diet that I just told you about, and then look at the equivalent that is your grandparents ate, right? So, for example, you know, in Italy, it may be my grandparents used to eat a lot of green beans. Maybe in India, it wasn't green beans, but it was some other form of beans that were very common in India. So yeah, that's I think what I mean when I say eat what your grandparents used to eat.
You've also said that the effects are the highest for risk patients. So does it just slow aging, diabetes or CVD, or can it actually reverse it?
Well, I mean, we saw in the clinical trial the people that were pre-diabetic clearly returning to the normal state, right? So yeah, it definitely can reverse it. We, as I just mentioned, just finished a diabetes clinical trial. We haven't published it yet. So let's see what happens when we look at 100 diabetic patients. But certainly, I'll say that in the data so far with a few patients, we see reversal of diabetes. We see reversal of prediabetes, but you know, we'll have to wait and see what the results of the formal clinical trial are to determine can it reverse diabetes in the general diabetic population.
But do you have any evidence on whether it can actually reduce the physical signs of aging? I mean, can I look 10 years younger if I follow your diet?
Yeah, so the paper we published in 2017 showed many changes that are associated with aging, so now we have a formal study on biological age, and this is in collaboration with Morgan Levine at Yale. So there are ways to measure biological aging, and so both at the molecular level and in the blood. And so that's what we're doing, and we hope to see that there is an actual reduction in the biological age.
Right. So can anyone go on your diet, or are there any contraindications? Do you advise, a visit to the doctor before starting a diet?
Yes, I advise a visit to the doctor, but yeah, most people between, say, age 20 and 70 can do it, but you have to be careful, right? So people that are anorexic, people that are pregnant, people that might have a disease and they're taking certain drugs. For example, it could be fasting and mimicking diet and fasting can be very dangerous if somebody's taking insulin or any insulin-like drugs. So yeah, always best to talk to your doctor before starting, and also, you know, trying to be careful that and know how this affects you.
What about children? Because obesity is also rising in children. Can they safely follow your diet?
Well, I think I wrote a book in Italy, in Italian and a few other languages a few years ago on children. And what we were recommending for children for everyday diet, we're recommending more of a Mediterranean diet, you know, so not as restrictive as the one that I just showed you, the longevity diet. And also for the fasting mimicking diet, we are beginning to start clinical trials on children. And the idea is it possible that, you know, let's say a child that was overweight or obese, if they were given this in a very controlled environment. So the first clinical trial at the Children's Hospital in Genova is starting now, but this is for type 1 diabetes. So we're using that to see, and children are being hospitalized during the fasting mimicking diet. So we want to see, are there any problems in children before we can do clinical trials on the children that do this at home. So yeah, we're going at it very carefully with the fasting mimicking diet. But I think that Mediterranean diet is probably a very good diet, but it should be regulated, meaning the starches, the pasta, the bread, the rice, the fruit juices, they should be limited. That's what we show in the book. That lots of people in Italy, Europe, United States, they take the Mediterranean diet, but then they abuse all the starches, all this, I call it in Italian the 4 Ps, which is pizza, pasta, potatoes, So I think that this modification of the Mediterranean diet are probably the best for children.
So when people are following the diet, can we cheat at all? Are you allowed tea, coffee, maybe a glass of wine? Is that okay?
Yeah, tea and coffee and a glass of wine are fine for the longevity diet, so the everyday diet for the entire year. The fasting mimicking diet, I think, should be done as described in the clinical trial, and we discourage tea is part of the fasting mimicking diet, but coffee and alcohol are not, and we basically say don't do any of it unless you're about to quit. So you get to the point where you say, if I don't have a coffee today, I'm going to stop this fasting mimicking diet. Then you should have the coffee rather than stopping.
So this is tea and coffee without milk and sugar.
Yeah. Well, no,
Sorry.
I mean, for everyday diet, you can have milk and sugar in the tea or coffee. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is abdominal circumference and BMI, right? So if your weight is normal, if you're lean, that means that that milk and sugar in the coffee is not a problem for you. But and usually I say, don't worry about the sugar in the coffee as long as you put like a small spoon in it. Worry about, so for example, in Italy, we talked to pediatrician, everybody was convinced that children were becoming overweight and obese, because of junk food, And when we looked at it, we realized it wasn't junk food at all. They had very little, or sugary drinks, right? Those were the two culprits. But when we looked at it, they were eating 0.5 kilogram a day of pasta, bread, rice, potatoes. That's where the problem was coming from. It wasn't coming from the candy, nor from the sugary drinks. It was coming from, really a ton of this refined carbohydrates that were part of the Mediterranean diet.
We've run out of time, Professor, so I'm going to just end on a personal question. I read that you went to Italy to be a rock guitarist, and then you studied jazz, and then you switched to nutrition. So do you want to tell us why you got interested? How did you make the shift from your rock guitar, jazz to nutrition?
Yeah, so I came to the United States from Italy to study rock and jazz, and I did that for a while. And then I think I was 19 years old. And I realized that I had such a passion to study aging, So I quit the music department and jazz performance, and I went over to the biochemistry department, and I just told the chair of the biochemistry department, I want to study aging, So I started, studying chemistry and biology, and I thought that was the way, and it was probably the correct choice. So so I've always had an incredible passion for aging. Nutrition is just part of it. We also work on other fields of aging and not just nutrition.
Thank you so much, and thank you for choosing aging, because it's going to help us a lot. We're going to miss your music, but thank you again for joining us. Over to you, Sunita.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjit. And what a fascinating session. Of course, it means that many of us who are listening have to rework their diets according to what the doctor suggests and recommends. Thanks very much. Well, that brings us to day 3, end of day 3 of the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit. But don't worry, we still have 2 more days of very exciting speakers coming up. For tomorrow, those of you who want a bit of a sneak peek, what we have coming up is Sundar Pichai. He'll be in conversation. And we also have a conversation with Madhya Pradesh Chief Minister Shivraj Singh Chauhan. So stay tuned for that. Goodbye, and thanks for watching.